some foundational thoughts on the nature of our international order. You've said, and I'm quoting, the world order is not natural. It needed to be built and it needs to be carefully maintained. And you go on to ominously say that liberal world order is far from inevitable. And I think you'd say the same actually of democracies like ours. They're gardens in a jungle. And you talk about identity politics. Well, that's probably the norm. And as we retreat from how we created the garden, which was by cooperation instead of competition, even with people that our neighbours, as G.K. Chesterton said, we're told to love our neighbours and love your enemies, and often they're the same. And that we learned to do that in our cultures. And now we're dissipating it away. But I digress. You make the point that the liberal world order is far from inevitable. Can you describe what you think a liberal world order is? Because we've lived under it for a long time, but people don't stop and focus on what it is and what a blessing it is. So what do you mean by it? How's it been achieved?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a massive question. I mean, essentially, the liberal world order refers to the emergence ultimately of American power after the Second World War.
Yeah.
And essentially, so what you had the United Kingdom, the Great Britain was the kind of the preeminent hegemon, if you will, within the international system prior to the Second World War. Although interestingly, the American economy had overtaken. This is a very interesting point, by the way. The American economy had overtaken the British economy by 1870 already. So obviously, when we talk about, for example, the rise of China and these other kind of things, there's no natural progression necessarily from economic primacy to security primacy and cultural primacy. So that's a very interesting point. So by the 1870, the Americans had already overtaken Great Britain, but it took two major world wars, and then it stumbled on post Second World War. You had the Greek intervention in the Civil War, for example, and then 1956, the Suez Crisis was really underlined that the baton for world power, if you would, passed fundamentally from the former European colonial powers to the United States. So the liberal world order really refers to the kind of the institutional architecture that was created and sustained by American power in the post-war international system. And it refers to a number of things. First, obviously, is the economic model. So it broadly speaking, American planners, along with some Brits as well, Maynard Keynes, for example, when they looked at the accelerants of the Second World War, how do we account for the rise of racist Nazism in Germany and the horror of that? One of the major accelerants of that were forms of economic nationalism. So in the face of the Great Depression, etc., many of the great powers, rather than remaining open, closed themselves down, so kind of became more autarkic or economically nationalist. So the economic model that guided the post-war international system, the liberal international order, was one of economic interdependence. And the idea essentially is, if you create these dense webs of economic linkages, you pacify the logic of interstate rivalry. So it's one of the main ways in which you counter the classic law of the jungle realist logic of international relations. If states trade with each other, then essentially they're far more disincentivized to go to war with each other. If that makes sense. So that was a kind of open economic model was a really interesting element of the post-war international system. And then the other one was obviously the institutional architecture of it. So you had the creation of the various Bretton Woods institutions like the United Nations, etc. And then you had security co-binding as well, so various security alliances that took place. So, for example, NATO, the US-Japan Security Pact, etc. So you had these various elements of the international liberal international order that was thrown up as a result of American power in the post-war international system, and kind of continued, but in the context of the Cold War as well. So that's the kind of broad architecture of the liberal international order. And then obviously within it, it had certain kinds of norms. So liberal democracy, for example, the rule of law, etc. So that's the liberal international order, if you will. That's the sort of standard take on the liberal international order. It has lots of critics, obviously, and it's kind of been differentially applied geographically. So essentially, so therefore, then you had economic interdependence between the Western states, at least, security co-binding, amongst states through various alliance systems, and then certain sets of norms within the liberal international order itself. And but that was also predicated on American military power. If you think, for example, at the end of the Second World War, the European powers were kind of largely industrially broken, again underlined by the failure of Suez, when the Americans told the French and the Brits and the Israelis to get the hell out of Egypt. So that was really underlined there. But the liberal international order was really based upon American power, essentially, as the key hegemon within that international system, which then leads to a very interesting question, doesn't it? Insofar as we see the rise of China, as we see America's relative economic decline, what does that portend for the liberal international order? If its institutional architecture, if the will of its to sustain it is predicated upon American power in terms of its capacity to create institutions, to underwrite institutions, to solve collective action problems, and all these kind of these issues that bedevil international relations. If the US sinks down or goes down, whether it's as a result of its relative economic decline with China, or whether it's as a result of it just sort of gives up the ghost. People, if you look at a lot of elite commentary now, there's talk even of like a new American civil war and potential secession between red and blue states in the US. So, I mean, that doesn't necessarily portend well for the maintenance of American hegemony. So I think that's kind of like a roundabout way, I think, John, of answering your question. But the final point I'd like to make is that isn't natural. If you think, for example, about European geopolitics, I mean, its norm is one of great power competition, offshore balancing, and war. So the liberal international order, in many ways, has solved a lot of problems with international politics, but it's tied ultimately to the will of the Americans. And if we buy the idea that America is in decline, what then does that portend for the future of the West and the future of the liberal international order?
Yeah, it's worth reflecting on this for a moment, isn't it? Because what you've said, I think, is very powerful and incredibly important, but not understood. We all love to hate the Americans. You see it everywhere at the moment. And people often do it so thoughtlessly until there's a crisis. And then where are the Americans? You can't, as one of your former prime ministers said when he was here in Australia, Tony Blair, there's no major problem confronting the world that can't be resolved without the Americans being engaged. But to go back to what you were talking about, in contrast, it was not the natural way of doing things. You look at the end of the First World War, you could sort of see a broad pattern of identity politics. You will pay because you opposed us. How dare you oppose us? The United Nations failed because there was a whole lot of retributive sort of attitudes and policies put in place. After the Second World War, the extraordinary generosity and farsightedness of the Americans to say to the Europeans, who were in a worse state a couple of years after the Second World War than they were at the end of the war, everything broken, people starving, I mean, just an absolute mess in much of Europe. The Americans came in with $13 billion US at the time in the so-called Marshall Plan. So it wasn't just military. You think of Berlin airlift, that was military, but economically, here is a whole lot of money if you'll break down those trade barriers that you were talking about, if you will cooperate economically. And it provided the carrot and sufficient stick for Europe to emerge as a peaceful bloc, by and large. So that was a massive force for good. Then you look at Japan and the efforts led by MacArthur, by the Americans there, not to pay out, not to destroy. And given the way the Japanese had behaved, and that was felt very deeply in Australia towards its people, it's still felt in China. What the Americans did reflected a great generosity of spirit. Why do I labour it? It's to emphasise what you're saying. It's not the natural order of things. It's not what human beings normally do. It requires a rising above, a believing in a real vision for a better future and asking the hard questions. Do you get there through cooperation or through competition, a la identity politics writ large or writ small? So it was good policy, thought through, I would argue, not without compassion, backed up by enormous military might, all seem to be in short supply or shorter supply, as you've said. Is it possible, let me ask you this question, to maintain that liberal global order as a philosophical thing, do you think, without the threat or possibility of violence?
It's a great question. I mean, I guess what you're saying, and I completely agree, is it matters who wins big wars. The domestic norms of whoever emerges victorious will affect ultimately the kind of international order that the victors then, or the victor then, constructs. Right? It's a really important point. Think, for example, if Hitler had won the Second World War, he would then have had an opportunity to construct a particular type of international order, right? Which would have had a very different inflection to the type of international system that the US constructed. So I completely agree. I think it really matters who wins major wars. And the kind of international system that they then go about constructing. And your question was about the philosophical nature of identity politics in the US now. So, I mean, I think that can the liberal international order sustain itself in this context of what does feel like a far more fractured Western international system? And I think that is a key question in terms of, if we think, for example, about the capacity of the West to sustain itself in the context of this kind of increasingly strong forms of identity politics, and what we see now in America is this the emergence of this identity politics and the kind of impact that's having on the American capacity to maintain the international system and the liberal international order.